Today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I talk with Len Uhley, writer of the Nightcrawler episode of X-Men the Animated Series, and how being a believer made that episode possible. And we'll get to all of that right after this. 2022 is flying by so fast, and I just reviewed my goals for the year. It's not too late to set some effective goals for 2022 for yourself. And the Goal Process 101 ebook helps you do just that. With a straightforward process and practical exercises, you'll be guided to set the right goals for you and set out a plan to achieve them. Get your copy of the Goal Process 101 ebook by going to goalprocess101.com. Use CNU2022 at checkout to save 10%. Now, back to the show. Len Uhley is a fantastic and prolific animation writer. Having written over 200 episodes of various animated shows, he's worked on many of the nerdy cartoons that you've probably seen, including things like Darkwing Duck, Iron Man, Static Shock, Avengers, Justice League, Ben 10, Veggie Tales. It's so many more. But for the Christian nerds, he's probably best known as the writer of the Nightcrawler episode from X-Men the Animated Series. It was amazing to connect with him, but before we get to our interview, let's read some scripture. Let's start with Colossians 3:23 through 24. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And 2 Timothy 2:15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. Lynn is a great example of someone who uses his talents to entertain, as well as, whenever possible, to share the truth of the gospel. The Nightcrawler episode shows he was not afraid to share his faith, and in his own words, he was chosen to write it because those around him knew about his faith. Now, let's get right into my interview with Len Uhley. Len, it is so great to have you on the show today. I want to welcome Len Uhley to the Christian Nerds Unite podcast. So tell us a little bit about who Len Uhley is.
Well, that could take days, but I'll do the short version. I'm a native of Los Angeles. I have always wanted to be a writer. I was a writer before I knew I wanted to be a writer. I think the first script I wrote is in a box somewhere. It was a Star Trek because, I was a fan, and I was writing musicals and student films in high school and college. And I had my first sale, professional sale, when I was a junior in college. It was an episode of a show no one remembers called Holmes and Yo-Yo. It was on ABC for 13 weeks. And then a year after that, in my senior year, I had a TV series format optioned. It's sort of like a mini Bible for a TV series. And that was, about the first black president of the United States. Like that could happen, right? But it was 1977, so it was a little ahead of its time. And so I said, oh, well, look, I've had 2 sales already before I got out of college. This is going to be easy. Rocket to the moon. What a career I'm going to have. And then 3 years of radio silence after that. So, first breaks, followed by more first breaks, followed by, work here and there. I was lucky early on, but really learned how to be a writer over several years, and then accidentally became an animation writer when I was writing industrials, corporate films, and stage shows. And one of the mom and pop companies I worked for, the pop was an actor named Michael Rye, who was the voice of Duke Igthorn on the Gummy Bears. And so he introduced me to Jim Magon, who was the story editor on the Gummy Bears, and I got to write one Gummy Bears and then one DuckTales called Where No Duck Has Gone Before. You can see a pattern forming here, right?
Nice. Well, hey, before you go any further, you said you wrote for Gummy Bears.
Yeah.
I just had Katie Lee on the show, who was one of the voice actors for Gummy Bears.
Yes, so basically we were starting more or less, I mean, she probably had started a little earlier, about the same time. And so, you know, our paths have crossed from time to time as well. But anyway, so then I got signed on a multi-year deal at Disney TV Animation. That was the beginning of my animation career. And that's what I've been doing basically ever since, occasionally getting some live action work, but mostly in animation. And so it's been a living, you know. I've been very fortunate.
Amazing. Well, talk to me a little bit about writing for animation, because I know, I mean, you mentioned you've done some live action, but not a lot, mostly animation. Is there a major difference when you're writing something for animation versus writing something for live action?
Well, let's see. Outside of the fact that you're paid 50% or less for each script, and you get no residuals, in most animation, there are the primetime, the Fox animated shows that are under Writers Guild deals, but most animation is not written under the Writers Guild, though you know they're making efforts. If you're under Local 839 of the IATSE, this is getting really into the weeds right away. Your fans are going to be thrilled about this. Like if I wanted a primer on labor relations, I would have tuned in another episode. But anyway, so you're writing, the process of writing is very much the same. Some animation scripts are a little more detailed in terms of stage direction, but we're all using the same software. We're all using probably Final Draft, and we're all writing dialogue and stage direction. And there's the difference is you're sometimes, but not always, directing more on paper in TV animation, particularly when I was starting out, when it was almost like each script was like shot for shot. You really had to really direct on the page, which is anathema when you're writing live action. They will give you the boot straight away if you do that. So writing, the process is the same. Breaking stories is the same. Yes, you're writing for a talking duck or a person in long underwear, but you know, quite frankly, writing for people in long underwear is $1 billion business for a lot of the studios. So, you know, it's a matter of animation often is the test bed, the proving ground for these giant franchises. I mean, as we've discussed off camera, I've written for most of these superheroes. I wrote on the X-Men series, and I wrote on lots of DC stuff. You know, all of it is writing for these same characters, but they are separate sort of parallel worlds when it comes to writing the cartoon version and then the live action stuff. There's very little crossover in terms of the creative personnel, but that's an issue for another day. Anyway, so I'm not sure I answered your question.
That's I think you did well. Now you actually just mentioned the X-Men. So why don't we jump into that, because that's part of the reason I wanted to get you on the show. For those who are not familiar with Len's name, Len was the writer for the X-Men animated series episode called Nightcrawler, which a lot of my Christian nerd fans will be familiar with that episode. If they've never seen any other X-Men animated series episode, they've probably at least heard about this one with the things that happened with Nightcrawler and with Wolverine in that episode.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about this story. First, how did you get on writing for the X-Men animated series? Because you wrote a couple of episodes. Was this the first one?
No.
Or was that one of the later ones?
Yeah. Well, I have to sort of roll back a bit. As I
Okay.
said, I was on staff at Walt Disney TV Animation for 5.5 years.
Hmm.
And one of the other writers that I knew there and became friends with, good friends with, is Eric Lewald, who was the showrunner on X-Men. And he left Disney before I did, some years before I did. And when I ended my time at Disney TV Animation, fortunately, Eric had already been running the X-Men animated series. He was sort of the writing showrunner. And then there's Larry Houston, who was the director producer. So Eric was responsible for all of the scripts and sort of designing that approach to that world. And so at the end of their third season, after I'd left Disney, Eric gave me an opportunity to write my first episode, which was called Cold Comfort. And Cold Comfort was the introduction to a character called Iceman, Bobby Drake. And that was a great episode for fans because it introduced a lot of other characters. We saw a flashback of the X-Men in their early sort of weird jumpsuity bits. And there was also X-Force. And it was a fanboy field day on that episode. And that was a great deal of fun. And a lot of that is because Larry Houston is this encyclopedia of Marvel details. So, he said, oh, we need to have this guy and that guy. And Eric and I worked together, and that's the script I wrote. Anyway, so then in what was their fourth season, I think it was the first episode of the fourth season.
That's what it's listed as on Disney Plus.
Right. And so I got a chance to write Nightcrawler. And so this will get into some of the stuff that's germane for your audience. But I had been going through a discernment process in terms of religion. We can sort of get into why that happened. But Eric knew that it was good casting. He knew that this was a topic that was interesting to me. This is the thing. I want to really be very clear to you and to your listeners. I am no religious expert by any stretch. I came to faith, such as it is for me, in adulthood. I was, raised not in any particular denomination, but after a family tragedy, after the death of my mom, I ended up at a church and felt at home and began the process of sort of feeling out that world because, I'd always had an interest. One of my favorite films growing up, or miniseries, was Jesus of Nazareth. Now, why did that move me so much? I don't know. But stuff like that always sort of piqued my interest. Anyway, so there I was, sort of finding my feet in a church, and Eric knew that, so he knew I could sling the lingo sufficiently. So I became. Eric was extremely good at casting a particular writer for a particular topic, and so he said, "Okay, there's this character that we want to use in the series." And he knew that he gave me the opportunity to write about Nightcrawler. And I did some digging on the character and his appearances in the comic books. And then it was an interesting process because initially we were very timid. We did your basic X-Men adventure story. And there was Nazi machine guns and snowmobiles and all kinds of dumb stuff. But by then, 4 seasons in, Eric and the people he worked with had sort of proven that they could handle all sorts of interesting topics in a serious way. They weren't going to be frivolous. They weren't going to be do anything that would reflect badly on Fox Kids and all that sort of thing. So they had this full support of Margaret Lesh, who was the head of all Fox Kids, and Avery Coburn, who was the standards and practices supervisor, and she was totally on board. And we had the executive who worked under Margaret Lesh, named Sydney Iwander. And Sydney, after we turned in our first sort of story treatment on this thing, said, no, I want to hear about a loving, giving God. What is all this other nonsense? So we pared it down. So God bless Sydney, right? So
absolutely,
he's a fascinating character. He's sort of a curmudgeon and deeply, deeply cares. He's sort of the network executive on the Batman the Animated Series. So he knew his comic book stuff backwards and forwards. And he is, kind of a scholar of all things, including New and Old Testament. Anyway, so we pared it down to a much simpler story. And it got down to basically a dialogue about faith and loss of faith. Faith with a character who has every reason to be cynical, who, because he looks like a demon, right? Nightcrawler.
Right.
Kurt. And you would think, okay, well, this is a guy, if he has any reason to be cynical and unhappy about his lot in life, that would be the guy. But no, he has profound faith. Okay. And meanwhile, you have Wolverine and dire and horrible things have been done to him. So he has whatever faith he may have had, whatever interest in faith he may have had, that's all been stripped away. So here he meets this guy who is so convinced that God is looking after them. And it was like, oh, that's a great dramatic situation. We have two people with diametrically opposed perspectives, and they can talk about this stuff. And of course, we still have to do an X-Men adventure where, there's dramatic stakes and violence to some extent and things like that. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And yeah, a lot of people still remember this episode fondly. It was probably the first mainstream cartoon to deal with issues of faith. Yes, there had been Davy and Goliath and all the other stuff that may have come before. And then later, there was...
Things that were explicitly Christian.
Yeah, I wrote for Veggie Tales. I wrote 12 episodes for a story editor named Sean Roach on a show called Superbook. Here's the teacup to prove it. And I worked on a British series called Friends and Heroes that was created by a Methodist minister back over in Britain. That was a cool show because they flew us over for story meetings in London several times. So, nice. That was a non-repeating phenomenon, but fondly remembered. And like I said, I wrote on Veggie Tales in various iterations. So I've had this weird, first one was something called Adventures from the Book of Virtues. That was a long time ago. I did a couple, 3 of those. So I've had this weird parallel career when I've been working on, DuckTales and Tailspin and, Ben 10 and all sorts of other. I did 2 American Tail home sequels, and so I was writing for a Jewish mouse. So that I cover all the bases. I wrote on a series that we never saw here in the U.S. called The 99, which was a superhero show, but created by a gentleman in the Middle East. Anyway, it's just I've been able to work on a lot of interesting shows. A lot of them, the secular shows, Static Shock, I mentioned Ben 10, wonderful experiences. But there's this, parallel thing where I've done some of these shows that you and your listeners enjoy sometimes, I hope.
Definitely. So you kind of went into it a little bit, the story of this particular X-Men episode.
Right.
So this was... somebody else had already kind of started, we want to use this character.
Yes.
And was it their intention all along to bring out this? It sounds like one of the producers was more on the line of, I want to tell more of the religious story there.
Well,
because you said their initial pitch was turned down.
Because, it wasn't, it was so like, we didn't know how far we could go. Eric is an academic, a student of history and literature and things like that. Really smart guy, the showrunner of this, Eric Lewald. And, but we'd all read enough about all of these characters that we were using because there were, source material provided by Marvel Comics. And so we were able to, we sort of honed in on what this show was about. And it was not, the notion of doing something like this was a little bit groundbreaking. And so we didn't know how far we could go. And then, the executive from Fox Kids said, go further. And the standards and practices woman, Avery Coburn, she agreed. And she said, I trust you, to Eric. And I'm just a freelancer. I'm coming in and doing one-offs. I'm not on staff. There was no staff really on the X-Men series. So Eric was, moving all these chess pieces to get all of these episodes made. I don't know what they did, 78 or something like that. So it's each episode had to have its own sort of internal logic and also be part of the greater arc. And the third episode I did was called Bloodlines, and that was about Nightcrawler again. And that was an exploration of his relationship with the mother he didn't know he had, who was Mystique, who's one of the big villains of that world. And, we got into why she was so profoundly dysfunctional. Again, the worst kind of villain in the world is the one who says, "Moo ha ha, I shall take over the world." Who cares? But you understand why Mystique is the way she is, and she's a horrible person. But the nice thing about writing anything really, live action or animated, is when you get into the stuff that's below the surface, that explores the human condition. I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm writing for a bear in a flying outfit, or if I'm writing for, people on a procedural drama, though I haven't had that opportunity. But, you are always writing about human feelings, human experience. Otherwise, nobody's going to care. It doesn't matter what the visuals are. If they're all wonderful and exciting and things are exploding, nobody gives a darn if it's not about something that touches you. And in the case of the work I've done on X-Men, with talking about an unresolved father-son dynamic with Bobby Drake and Professor X, or the religious dynamic debate between Wolverine and Nightcrawler, or the unresolved, unhappy childhood of Nightcrawler and why he was seeking out his mother and then forgave her for what she did. Those are all important things. I've been very fortunate to work for a lot of story editors, showrunners, who have given me a chance to do stuff that's about more than everybody after the treasure, and that there's a place for that. I love those romps too. They're fun to write. But, working for Alan Burnett on Static Shock, got a chance to write. I did an episode about a character who was homeless and mentally ill, and so you could delve into that a little. And it happened to be a holiday-themed episode, so that all got tied in together. Alan and the great Dwayne McDuffie, for whom I later worked on Ben 10, they wrote an episode about gun violence. A kid brings a gun to school. They won a Humanitas Award for that. Once in a while, cartoons actually can have and really move people. And when you rolling back now, sorry, I've digressed, but going back to Nightcrawler, when we were going to conventions, I would go there with Eric and his wife Julia, who was also a writer on the X-Men series, and Larry Houston, who was the producer-director of the series. We would have these panels, and people would come up and they would say to us how much the show meant to them. One guy came up and it was really extraordinary. It was like one of the last San Diego Comic-Cons we attended. This guy who came up there, he looked like Jack Black dressed as Wolverine. Really, stocky guy, sort of done up with the lumberjack clothes, and he had the blades and the whole thing. And he told us it was so powerful for us because he said, I had a rough childhood, but I came to I stuck around, he said, because I wanted to see what the next episode was of X-Men. Okay. We just think we're writing a show and we're entertaining people, but it becomes really important to folks. And there have been people who've come up to me about the Nightcrawler episode and said, this gave me a chance to discuss something with my dad that I couldn't talk about before. One guy said he became an evangelical person somewhat because of this episode. And I'm saying, whoa, not my job. Hold on. But nevertheless, it's humbling. It makes you sort of like say, wow, what we do is not just filling the space between the commercials. It has meaning for people, and that's an extraordinary feeling. I mean, we also like residuals, but that's another topic that we've discussed previously. But anyway, it is really nice that people like what we do, and I've been very fortunate. I've been able to do this for several decades now, and one of the examples of a show that people remember fondly is the X-Men series and this particular episode of Nightcrawler. Anyway, I've rambled on too long. You probably have another question to ask.
Well, let's dive into this idea a little bit. You've talked about, you've dealt with some pretty heavy subjects on what most people would consider a kids show.
Right.
When you're writing something like that, are you thinking, I want to write this for kids, or or do you think that overall children are actually more prepared to talk about these subjects than some people think they are? Or do you think it's more of a, the audience is broader than, I just want to write what is meaningful to me, and I'm going to put it on the page, and I'm going to put it out there, and if it connects, it connects, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. How does that work? All of that.
All of that. Here's the thing. The dirty little secret is we always write to entertain ourselves. Anybody that does any creative endeavor, you're doing it. You've got to become and be engaged by the material. Otherwise, it's not going to be very good. Getting a chance to write any story that's put out in a mass medium, the responsibility is to be entertaining, and if you get to be thought-provoking, and you get to write stuff that will keep the parents entertained as well as the kids, because let's face it, there's there are people who just plant their kids in front of the TV as a babysitter, but you're also hopeful that the parents and the kids are watching together, and if the parents want to stick with it, we've slept through, when our daughter was young, we slept through a lot of Pokemon stuff, but not knocking it. I wish I had a piece of the action, let me tell you. But it's like we get a chance to do something that engages people. How great is that? What an opportunity! What a privilege that is, So we're writing for ourselves, and we're again at the same time we're also cognizant of the sort of the target audience. I'm not going to write a film about a cartoon about drug addiction on My Little Pony. Maybe there are people who know how to do that. I probably couldn't. I mean, some jobs some shows lend themselves to serious topics, and some do not. And the worst thing you can do is trying to do a very special episode on a show that just can't carry that. Having said that, however, I think there is more opportunity on more shows than sometimes the people who make those shows or the people who provide guidance to the networks and the studios give kids credit. I think kids do get a lot more than the experts think. But then I'm not a psychologist. They have data to back up their perspective, and I just go by my gut, because I remember when I was quite young and watching, well, let's just say Warner Brothers short subjects, the Bugs Bunny stuff. Some of that was very adult, and it was because it was designed to be a short subject in a movie theater. It was for an entire family audience. Everybody who went to the theater saw that show at the same time. So when we watched it on television, it was like, okay, some of that goes over your head. But then you want to know what that means. You're reading Mad Magazine when you're 7, and you're saying to yourself, I don't get that joke, but I know it's supposed to be funny. Why is it funny? And you begin to sort of develop a taste, a sense of humor, and an interest in more stuff, more what does that content mean? And you grow up into it. So when we're doing a show like working on something like Ben 10 or Static Shock, and we can do big, funny, silly bits, and then we can do serious stuff, I was very fortunate. Like I say, Alan Burnett I worked for on Static Shock, the brilliant Dwayne McDuffie, who co-created Static Shock and created Milestone Comics. Dwayne passed in 2011, and it's a terrible loss because he was absolutely a bona fide genius, terrific guy. And so you get a chance to have people who are saying, okay, let's do something different. Let's expand the boundaries. It's a wonderful privilege. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it's like, oh, wow, I get to flex different muscles, And so I'm very, very fortunate that I've been able to have a chance to do that on several occasions for various shows.
I loved talking to Len about his experience writing for so many different animated series. Len and I talked for so long, I had to make this 2 episodes. So make sure you check back next week for part 2 of our interview. If you want to keep up with what Len is currently working on, follow him on Twitter at Len Uhley. And I'll put a link to his Twitter down in the show notes below. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, share, follow, click all those buttons down there, whatever they are, and so that you can keep up with us as we release new content. And you can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel, and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, click on the support tab. We would love to have you as a Patreon. Before we go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Philippians 1. And this is my prayer: that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best, and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.